Good evening, and welcome to tonight's panel, Why Racist Symbols Have to Go, co-hosted by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Center for Womanist Leadership. I'm Christine Luckritz Marquis, Associate Professor of Church History at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and I have the honor tonight of sort of offering some introductory historical context to our conversation, giving us some very loose frameworks to begin our conversation. And when I'm done with that, I'll pass it off to the moderator for the evening. Now, I want to start by saying that statues serve as visual markers of power. And so just as there have always been statues, there have always been people enacting memory sanctions against statues, defacing and toppling them. Now, what do I mean by memory sanctions? These are the acts that people do publicly to condemn an individual's memory, right? That is, they don't want the person's memory to just go into oblivion and forget them, but we actively want to condemn that person and keep remembering to condemn them. Now, I also want to say that setting up statues and tearing them down both very intentionally craft very clear visual sorts of messages. A statue is erected to memorialize in a very positive way an individual's memory, often even idealized, sort of erasing sort of unsavory past aspects. Similarly, communal abuse of a statue also has a very clear message of trying to symbolically invert world power, right? So the statue represents a certain power structure, and by abusing that, the community lets that power structure know that the power structure isn't representing the community properly. So when early Christians, which is sort of my area of specialty, first came to power in the 4th century, they participated in just these sorts of acts. So they memorialized by taking over temples and building churches alongside, or sometimes even in temples, and they toppled cultic statues. And they did both of these to convey the collapse of so-called pagan religiosity and the rise and dominance of the Christian God. This is important because what this tells us is memory sanctions and memorialization sit at the heart of the Christian tradition. They are one of the earliest things that we participated and continue to participate in throughout history. Now, what does the early Christian moment have to do with our own historical context, right? There's a lot that has changed in the world, but one of the things that I think is very similar and relevant for our conversation is the treatment of statues, both the reverence and the disdain with which they may be treated. So right now we are having all these arguments over the presence of Confederate statues and Confederate flags and over statues of Christopher Columbus across the United States. Now, each of these also has its own historical context that isn't just our moment, and these historical contexts emerge in a moment or in several moments actually, in which white Americans narrated their identity over and against people of color, those in this country who have historically been abused, dehumanized, and killed. So for example, in Richmond, Virginia, where I live, on Monument Avenue, several statues were placed beginning in 1890 with Robert E. Lee after the Civil War, right? So this wasn't an immediate thing after the Civil War, but this was decades after. And actually the land that Robert E. Lee's statue was put on was given by a family friend who actually also happened to be a land developer and wanted to create an exclusively white community on the western edge of Richmond City. Now, a few years later in 1907, J.E.B. Stuart and Jefferson Davis's statues are also put up, and that actually makes it an avenue rather than just a single monument, and thus begins the real development of Monument Avenue. But it's right at that moment that Black Virginians are simultaneously being disenfranchised through a variety of laws, including more restrictive voting laws. That is, we can't understand the history of these statues being erected without recognizing that they were built in dialogue with white repression of Black political engagement and economic autonomy. Now, similarly, this Confederate flag, what we call the Confederate flag, was actually originally the battle flag of the Northern Virginia Army under Lee. So once you have Lee's statue and you have this whole narrative of the lost cause, and Lee is this righteous man of God, and this appears in church imagery and in textbooks, right, that he was righteous and he was a holy man, right, which has these very clear theological implications. By extension, the flag that he battled under becomes the Confederate symbol par excellence, right? And his battle flag becomes what we now call the Confederate flag. But it doesn't actually become popularized until 1948 when the Dixiecrats pick it up as a sort of political response to the growing civil rights movement. And throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, as Black civil rights protesters and their allies began to ask for equality, white Southerners, and particularly their government officials, began to fly the flag, including on state capitol grounds, of the Confederacy, right? So we need to understand that the Confederate flag in its context was not actually Southern heritage as it's so often talked about. It was 100 years after the Civil War ended that the flag became popular in response to civil rights protesters asking for equality and integration. And if you're asking yourself, what does Christopher Columbus have to do with any of this? I would note that several of his statues have been toppled in recent days, including here in Richmond. And that's because if statues of Confederate generals and Confederate flags represent white domination over Black bodies, Christopher Columbus is the parallel of white domination over indigenous bodies. So the indigenous people who had lived on these lands for hundreds of years, Christopher Columbus's so-called discovery issued in the beginnings of the brutalization, the dehumanization, and the death of indigenous peoples that continues to this day. Thus, the pulling down of Christopher Columbus or Jefferson Davis or a Confederate flag all express the same message of inversion of the world that I talked about, like in antiquity. And in this particular case, a call for the end to white supremacy. And just to get this out of the way now as a part of the context, while statues may appear as benign objects, they're never merely apolitical art. Like sometimes you'll just hear, oh, well, they're just pretty, right? Art is always political, and the erection of all these symbols, but especially the statues and flag we're going to be discussing tonight, are political claims to power of one group over an oppressed other. And it's precisely for that reason it shouldn't surprise us that we're having these struggles, these very sort of active struggles over these symbols. They're conduits for violent struggle between the powerful and the oppressed. And the sort of last thing I want to share with us, right, because we're starting at early history and sort of moving forward, is the Christian charge of Jesus to stand with the oppressed invites us to reconsider all these historical contexts and their continued meanings. And so that's what I am excited to hear us discuss this evening. And with that, I turn it over to you, Rodney.
Thank you so much, Christine, for a brilliant introduction. Wonderful as always. I'm the Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler. I'm the director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation here at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and I'm pleased to come to you today. I was on a trip with my daughter about a week ago, going to the mountains of North Carolina, and as we drove down Highway 40, we noticed a large Confederate flag hanging up. We had a good day so far, and then we saw that flag, and my daughter started to get worried. As we drove further, she actually asked me, Dad, will we be accepted on the hiking trail? Will there be people there that think that that flag is a good idea? This flag is continuing to disturb us even years later, a symbol of a system that perpetuates the dehumanization of Black and brown peoples in this country. Well, tonight we're going to talk about symbols. We're going to talk about how they have power over us. And before we do that, I want to introduce to you our larger panel. We'll start with just asking basically people to identify us by their name, their place of service, and then what brings us to this conversation. We will start with womanist first. We'll start with my colleague from up north, Ebony Marshall-Turman. Dr. Turman.
Thank you, Rodney. It's so wonderful to be here. My name is Reverend Dr. Ebony Marshall-Turman, and I teach theology, ethics, and African American religion at Yale University Divinity School. I am here at your invitation, of course, as a theological ethicist, thinking always about structural evil and its intersection with signs and symbolism, and how we might continue the work of resisting structural evil as it relates specifically to Confederate symbols.
Thank you so much, Ebony. Our next speaker will be pastors a large church here in Richmond, Virginia, one that was the cathedral of the Confederacy, Dr. Charles Dupree. Charles.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm privileged to be a part of this conversation. I'm Charlie. Everybody can call me Charlie. That's just fine. I am the rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, which is downtown. I've been there since August. And we have lots of connections to the Confederacy, to lost cause ideology, and have been in conversation about many of the symbols that we've been talking about tonight. And most recently, we were tagged as a part of some of the protests. And so there's been a lot of conversation around what to do with that graffiti and how do we continue to respond and speak into this conversation as a church. So I just kind of represent the normal church congregation, figuring out how to be a part of this and how to respond.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Really appreciate your presence here tonight. Our final panelist is a man who's dear to my heart, one of my favorite newscasters of all time here in Charlotte, North Carolina, a man who's done so much work on this that has been enlightening to the general public, Mr. Steve Crump. Steve.
I feel like I should write you a check after that introduction. My name is Steve Crump. I'm a reporter with WBTV in Charlotte, which is the CBS affiliate. And I've had the pleasure and the opportunity going back some, nearly 30 years of doing more than 24 documentaries relating to the African-American experience and a lot of what has happened in the South. My travels have taken me from Selma to Appomattox to Richmond, all across the South, where we've done stories on these statues. I was around when the flag came down in Columbia, South Carolina, and also covered the tragedy at Mother Emanuel 5 years ago last week. So I'm hoping that my experiences as a journalist can add to tonight's discussion.
Well, I'm sure they will. Thank you so much, all panelists, for joining us tonight. Let me start off with a basic question just about these monuments as symbols in general. What does it mean to have these markers that represent America's tragic racial past continually in public view? And what do these symbols say about our collective identity as Americans? I'll open that up for any of you to jump into.
I think in many regards, it comes down to what can you relate to, what's in our family's histories, the various reference points, be it cultural, be it racial, be it geographic. You find yourself in, the big story coming out of NASCAR is the Confederate flag and what the sport wants to do with that. And even perplexing enough, where you're running races in places like Pocono up north and Las Vegas and the like that had nothing to do with the Civil War. But you also find in some regards that there are people that find themselves, carrying this flag or being a part of the festivities. So, there's no one easy answer to this particular scenario.
I think, Rodney, that in addition to it being our racial past being a tragic past, we also must, I think, theologically grapple with our racial history being a sinful past. And I believe that the current presence of these symbols of hate, they show us, they tell us unequivocally that Black lives do not matter still, right? To just be very direct. And they function more broadly as, in one sense, mechanisms of discipline for non-white bodies, and specifically as it relates to the Confederate flag, and Confederate monuments, Black body, and Columbus, right? Because Columbus initiates in many ways the modern project of racialization, right? And suppression of his so-called discovered world where there were already people and civilizations and everything else going on, right? So for all of it, right, these are mechanisms of discipline, right? To suggest to people who in theory have been freed, but we know that we continue to fight contemporarily for our freedom, right? In theory or by law, depending on how you understand the 13th Amendment, like you are not free. You are not free. And the presence, right, of the disciplining eye, right, the eye of the master vis-a-vis Confederate statues is always watching and always has the capacity to enter in and to subject, right? And so these monuments recall a very specific history, right? Because we know that history is, I'm sorry, I could go on and on about this. Let me wrap it up before you say amen, right? History is multitudinous. There are micro histories, there are counter histories, right? But these monuments in the various ways in which they manifest, they narrate a very particular history, right? A history that has always said that the non-white, non-male, non-cisgendered non-land-owning body does not matter. For Black people, that means even still Black lives don't matter, which is why we are tearing these monuments down. We and us and our allies are tearing these monuments down today.
Thank you.
And then I'm speaking for what happens when those creep into our sacred spaces. My bishop has said that this is a political issue, but it is also a spiritual issue. And the thing that I think the churches need to be about, if they are going to be living sacraments, if they are going to be reflections of resurrection and reflections of Jesus of Nazareth, then they've got to reflect the idea that everybody is equal, that everybody is free. And the last thing I want is for somebody to come into my church. Church is uncomfortable enough anyway, right? Last thing I want is for people to come in and see marks that make them feel like they don't belong. And then it gets to the point where you don't even notice them anymore. And I think that's, especially in churches, you just don't notice them anymore. I mean, but I say that, and I'm coming from a white man's perspective. So I cannot pretend to know what it feels like to look at these marks from any other perspective but that. But I just know that the church needs to be a steward of this moment, to be good and responsible stewards of this time.
Let me jump in here, if you will, to piggyback on the spiritual part of it, Reverend Dupree, which is, people talk about, and if you want to get into like an ecclesiastical mindset, from the standpoint of where, and for me personally, I'm, fifth generation Roman Catholic. I did 12 years of Catholic school. So there has always been this seminal sense of programming. But, in many respects, we talk about how slavery, how racism is America's original sin. I mean, we get that part of it. Now, if you're dealing with sin, and at least in my faith, we are taught to go to confession. So when does this country go to confession? When do we find penance, okay? And when is there the absolution that we get as a result, of saying, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, in terms of here are the wrongs that we've done, and perpetuating this level of indignity, this level of hate, and even in as much as, what it is people see that impacts them in a way that amplifies the pain of that sin.
Amen. Thank you. It sounds like what we're saying is that these symbols have incredible power to shape the world in which we live. And we can't deny that power because to deny that power is to allow that power to exist almost outside of our ability to control it. We have the ability to control this, but we have to claim the power of these symbols. As we think about these symbols, one of the things that we talk about quite frequently is some people say that they are symbols of heritage, while other people say that they're symbols of hate. We've seen some shift in this dialogue over recent times, but I want you to delve into this. Are they symbols of heritage? Are they symbols of hate? And how do we mediate between those two poles?
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. And I think that to suggest that they are is, demonstrates a level of unknowing or ignorance that needs to be challenged, right? Heritage can absolutely be hateful. And I think when we, no, we can't deny, I can't deny that I'm a descendant of slaveocracy and the rape of Black women, right? Under the logics of American slavery. Like, I can't deny that. That is part of my heritage, right? And at the same time, it is also a very, it comes to be, right, under a very hateful paradigm, under a very hateful kind of national or colonialist impulse. And so the two are not mutually exclusive. It can be, the Confederate flag is part of American history, yes, but it's hateful. And it's not something that ought to be celebrated or centered, right? Or given the kind of visibility as if it is the primary identifier or characteristic of who we are.
But you cannot deny the fact that it was used as a source of intimidation. Cases in point, look at, the Greensboro sit-ins, or either in places like Rock Hill, South Carolina, where John Lewis endured a fierce beating, where you had people that waved this flag in their faces, even though on the other side, there were students, primarily African-American college students, that said, no, we want equal rights. So where's the equality in the stars and bars?
And one of the things that we don't talk about in this conversation, I love the way that you frame this as what we think about as the Confederate flag as coming into being, coming into significance in the 1940s or so. And one of the things that we don't realize is, or we don't talk about as much, is that the Confederate flag did have a previous life. If you look at the symbolic coins that were given to members of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1900s, 1908, 1909, we see that not only is this what we call the Confederate flag figured prominently on it, but so is the KKK as well. I mean, this was something that was popularized by America's first terrorist group. And it continues to be a terrorist expression even today. So I think this notion, and thank you, Dr. Turman, for lifting up that notion of hate, and then Mr. Crump for lifting up that notion of intimidation, seems to be inherent in its power.
And I would just say, I would tie the statues into that as well, right? That as the rise of the KKK is emerging, that's like when some of our last statues in Richmond are being, I mean, like they're very much in dynamic dialogue that you're constructing, right? The historian in me wants to say we have facts, right? And I'm not the only one, but like we have facts, but there are a lot, as Dr. Turman was saying, like there are lots of different ways we can tell stories, right? That it depends on which, I always talk to my students, like it depends very much which facts we pick up, whose story we tell. And some of those stories, and I tell my students that history telling is an ethical act, right? It really matters whose story you tell, because you can hurt people if you tell stories of hate, to borrow that language.
Yes.
Right, and emerging from womanist kind of theological, theoethical imagination, especially through the work of womanist ethicist Emily M. Towns, right? There's this understanding that history or the facts, to your point, Christine, and the truth do not always align, right? The facts and what actually happened are not always, there's not always similitude there. And so we have to be careful to really interrogate our truths as they kind of come into confluence with the facts of history.
Here's something that I think that fails to be addressed and gets lost in the argument. There were many variations of a Confederate flag. I mean, and what we see right now is the one, Dr. Sadler, that you speak of, with connections to Virginia, but there were so many state militias that had their own, they all did not look alike. And even in as much as the whole notion, and it's kind of a double-edged sword, a bit of a dichotomy, if you will, where, some of the folks in Richmond are saying, oh no, if you, take these monuments down, it's going to hurt our tourism. However, in South Carolina, by leaving the flag up, you had conventions that pulled out, such as the NAACP state convention, which they did here in Charlotte for a number of years. You also had the NCAA, which would not bring any sporting events there. And even in as much as everybody likes to tout their states as being wonderful economic engines, you had a lot of Fortune 500 companies. It's like, no, I think that we're going to take a pass until they get this flag thing corrected.
Amen. Amen.
I like the idea that you had about confession, and I think that is an important space into which a lot of churches are moving right now. I think the danger could be, though, is that once you confess, is everything done? Right? I think that this is an ongoing thing that churches need to invest in. In 2015, I mentioned our connections to the Confederacy, and it will be apparent to everyone who walks into that church that there are a lot of marks of the Confederacy in there. So in 2015, St. Paul's tried to begin to change that narrative. And in the process of a renovation, 6 of wall plaques were taken down that were connected to the Confederacy, and 2 kneelers. Some of the plaques had, the battle flags were covered over. And then just this past week on Friday, our vestry decided to remove 7 more plaques that are directly connected to the Lost Cause era, and to rededicate 4 of the windows that had been dedicated to Davis and to Lee. So those are the types of steps that I think that we need to be taking, but they can't be just like, we've done that, we've checked that box, and now we're done. It's got to be backed up by study, by prayer, by interrogation of our history. I believe it's really important for us to know who we are, and only when we do that and look at that honestly will we really be able to change the ship. And so that's how I'm approaching colleagues who come to me and want to know what they should be doing about this. It begins with that honest interrogation of history, and putting the scaffolding in place and the trust in place to have those conversations.
I think that's right, Charlie. I think that this idea of confession does have the capacity to be stunted if we are not careful. And I really appreciate you lifting that up. I believe that that is also why kind of lamentation and repentance are so important. And when we think about confession, you know, I'm a Baptist, so we are very autonomous. We don't typically,
this is an ecumenical group.
We don't typically traffic in this kind of language, but just if we extend kind of the metaphor of confession to an appropriate end, we recognize that confession always, almost always, from my knowledge, at least of the Catholic Church, requires penance. And so if we extend the metaphor, that we need to be serious as we do the interior work of lamentation and repentance, right? Once we have confessed our complicity, then we also have to think seriously about what penance looks like. And that can't be limited to just tearing down statues, because the effects, to the economic point that Steve lifts up, the effects of the Confederacy and the logics of its symbolism still guide not only our national framework, but the way in which civics plays a role in our theological imaginations as well. We are really formed as U.S. citizens by racism. We are formed by the logics of genocide and violence, and we are formed by logics of rapeability. And we need to kind of wrestle with that very seriously, lament, repent, and then repay for what for how we are complicit.
When you speak of penance, I mean, it's almost, and forgive me for sounding overly cynical, but, you know, so it's like, all right, say 5 Hail Marys and 3 Our Fathers and add water and stir and we'll let you go, you know. But the point is, and when you look at, when you have this whole level of people trying to deal with this issue, you know, in South Africa, they had Truth and Reconciliation. You know, you had people such as President Clinton, the renowned scholar John Hope Franklin, you know, and you even had American voices building this framework of repentance, reconciliation, and a fact of coming together. We have not had that honest dialogue in this country. And to go back to what Dr. Dupree has said, you know, to use the term lost cause, absolutely. Cases in point, plural. You know, in Germany, if you're out bearing a swastika, you can't do it. It's against the law. So what has happened with a lot of the alt-right groups in Germany, they've co-opted the Confederate flag for their supremacy gatherings. You know, and I mean, are you going to find, even though you have this whole thing with Lee and Jackson and everyone else, are there any statues of Hitler in the public domain in Germany? And the answer is no.
Amen. And thank you for that. And if you think about the Hebrew Bible and the way that it talks about notions of repentance, it always talks about the notion of not just apologizing for something, but fostering a mode of restoration. So that becomes a necessary part, as Dr. Terman was lifting up, Marshall Terman was lifting up. There needs to be not just a turning away from something, shuv, to turn away from something. There also needs to be a compensation or recompense, which truth and reconciliation leads to notions of reparations, which are definitely instrumental as we talk about going a bit further here. I want to lift up a question, though, that has to do with a little bit about low-hanging fruit. It's possible that most of these governments that are wrestling with this now, the governor of Virginia, the governor of North Carolina, the city councils in Richmond and Charlotte, they could have made these decisions long ago to get rid of these statues. We're in a crisis moment in the fight for struggle for Black lives. We're at a moment when we need to see true systemic change. Is it a distraction to focus on these symbols now, to try to have these as victories over these symbols? Does it turn us away from dealing with the significant root causes of systemic racial disparity at this time? I just want us to ponder that for a second.
I think some of it's a byproduct when you look at the issue of finding the substance over the symbolism, and even in as much as the remedies, there's something that we use in the television business, which is proof of performance, which then becomes the measuring stick. In other words, are we better than we were 6 months ago or a year ago? What are the goals and outcomes? And I think that when you begin to kind of navigate through those points, and how do you become inclusive enough to allow the extra voices to weigh in, because it's not everybody has the answer. I mean, in some respects, there are some people that may bring something to the table that other individuals may not have thought of.
I think that both are important, Dr. Sadler. I think to be sure, right, we could get lost perhaps in the kind of catharsis of having these symbols removed, and kind of the joy that may engender in our communities, and the way that it really feels like a battle won. But it seemed, I can't help but think of Charles Long when I think about symbolisms and how he makes an argument much more intelligently than I'm about to rehearse here, but essentially the way in which symbols can function as God, right? And so with the tearing down of the strongholds of the Confederacy in the form of statues and flags, right, we're actually tearing down the symbol of a white supremacy or white superiority as God. And I think that especially for those of us who are theologians, or at least inclined to be thinking theologically and thinking at the intersection of kind of religion and society, that is meaningful, right? To destroy a God, and I think Dr. Marquis, she alluded to this earlier, to destroy the white God, right, is powerful. It is symbolic, but it is also very material when we think about the structures that emanate from this God or godlessness. And also thinking about Long talks about how Black people have long kind of, within the context of kind of this American symbolism, right? The gods of American symbols have lived in silence. And I think that what we're seeing now, as we have seen at other moments in history, is Black people and other people of color and white allies, but Black people in particular, are breaking the silence. And I think in order to hold our political officials accountable for the political action and the legal action that needs to be concurrent with the tearing down of these strongholds, with the white God, is is continuing. What we need to do is to continue to lift our voices, to break the silence, to demand being heard, and thus to hold the public square accountable beyond the symbolism. But the two have to go together. You can't change the laws and say kumbaya and still have Robert E. Lee in the center of downtown. You got to do both.
The other side of that becomes, though, the fact that you have the people that support the Robert E. Lees of the world talking about their Christianity and how their level of religion, has propelled them to take the stance that they take.
And I think that's where it's incumbent upon church leadership too. I mean, again, I'm bringing my kind of, what do I believe about this from the regular church priest perspective or whatever. I think it's up to, we were talking earlier about white Jesus. And I think it's up to church leaders to model different ways of expressing Jesus and different ways of talking about God. And I think it's up to us to model and reflect that in our preaching and the ways that we depict God and the ways that we depict Jesus. And I think about that word systemic, right? If we don't change something, the system is going to stay intact. I mean, that's the way I see it. If we don't do something, and in this case, kind of in the case of me and my congregation, if we don't do something that reflects what's also happening out in the public square, then we're just a museum.
Amen.
And we can't be a museum. We can't leave these museum pieces in place. Just put them in museums if we want that to be the case. But I'm just really intentional about not being a museum. And that means we've got to preach the gospel differently. We've got to embody the gospel differently. And we've got to turn this into something that's living and dynamic. And I think that's what our churches need to be about right now.
Thank you for that. I think that's so true. I think just listening to all of what you've been saying here, this is not an either or decision. This is a, how do we deal not only with the systemic racism and those systems that are in place that perpetuate that, as well as the ideology that undergirds it, because that ideology is quite potent and can perpetuate, once we change the laws, it can continue to perpetuate some of the same modes of thinking, same modes of oppression, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let's be practical now. First question from the audience. And let me say that if you're out there and you have a question, please type it in the, either in the chat or on Facebook Live. You can tap it in there as well. And we'll get that and try to get the question into this conversation. First question that we have is, as a Presbyterian pastor, how do you begin to engage your congregation in this conversation? How much you begin to broach this very difficult conversation, particularly if you've got people in your congregation who are the children of Confederate soldiers, the great-great-grandchildren of Confederate soldiers. How do you begin to have this conversation?
Is that for me?
It can well be for you, Charlie. You can start.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, for me, I think it's just about like creating that space where you start off very, very slowly, right? Start off very, very slowly, honoring the fact that people are going to have different perspectives, kind of start a lot earlier and ahead of where you think you need to start. For me, I've always been in majority white congregations. And so just to get people to talk about white privilege, I think that's one of the major ways that we have been able to have these conversations more effectively, and getting congregations to talk about their own white privilege and recognize their privilege, and doing that in a way. I mean, I'm shocked at often when people, it just blows my mind that they aren't further down the road, right? So we've kind of got to start there with reading Waking Up White Fragility, those types of books that we've all read, and then just continuing to keep at it and to to do all of that modeling from the pulpit, modeling in our teaching, and keep in mind that people are at really different places.
You know, in some respects, when in fact, and you talk about Jesus in the New Testament, and I think, you know, I'm reminded of that parable with the Good Samaritan. And when you look at that story, it was someone, you know, of another race that took care of this person that was found on the side of the road. You know, I mean, so in his own way, I think that Jesus, in sharing that story, at least dealt with the issue of some division, even though it might be just, you know, a few passages in the book of John, if I'm not mistaken. But, you know, the other side of that is, how does that particular episode transcend into something that we all revere called the Beatitudes?
Mm-hmm.
I so appreciate, may I jump in here, Dr. Sadler? I so appreciate your point, Steve, in pointing to Jesus. And I am curious about Charlie's point about going slow. Because, you know, when you said that, Charlie, I just thought immediately of MLK's Why We Can't Wait.
Yeah.
And I also thought about, for as much, you know, you are using the word, or you have used the word normal congregation to kind of characterize your parish work. And I think about, you know, the congregation that I belong to, the one that I served for 10 years, and what would be normal to me. And there, you know, I'm thinking about the fact that it's been 401 years. It's been 401 years. How much slower can we go? I mean, I don't want my children, you know, I don't want to have to be afraid for my children. I don't want my daughter to have to climb a flagpole. God bless Bree Newsom in South Carolina, you know, because, and this is, please hear this as generously as you can, but because a pastor, whomever, I'm a pastor too, but a pastor decided that we have to go slow because we don't want to hurt people's feelings.
I hear you.
I don't know about that, you know, and having taught, you know, I've taught in seminaries in the South. I taught at Hood Theological Seminary in Salisbury. I taught at Duke Divinity School in Durham. And, you know, I've had students who have been formed in the bowels of white supremacist Christianity in my classrooms. And so I understand with particular acuity how this shows up in the world. And for as slow as we go in the spaces where we ought to Steve's point, be preaching Jesus, which is Jesus is unequipped. There, I mean, you can't argue with Jesus where Jesus comes down on this. And does that, how many more will die? How many more of us will be lynched? Because we will not stand, to Steve's point, and really disciple our parishioners and disciple our students in our seminaries to stand on the side of Christ, which is with the oppressed, always. I could go on, but I just wanted to voice that because, you know, why we can't wait any longer. It's been 401 years.
Yeah. I preached on Sunday about Jesus saying, don't think I came to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. And I think that Jesus, I use the image of Jesus's life being a sword, right? The thing that creates, that separates. So I hear you, you know, and I take it. I still, from my perspective, the worry is that if we go too fast with some people in my congregation, that nothing will change.
But the other side of that
Context.
becomes,
You've got
I'm
to do a
sorry.
little bit of both, right? There's got to be a balance, right?
And
There got to be opportunities to go fast, and then maybe some opportunities to.
let me just say this, though. I mean, as we talk about this issue, we get back to the fundamental concern that's on the table, i.e. Black Lives Matter. If Black Lives Matter, those who are asking for the gradual change are arguing against that Black Lives Matter. They're arguing against the significance of the impact of this on Black and brown people across the country. They're saying that it's my comfort, my white privilege says that you need to take it slow so that we're not offended, while and you can continue to suffer the indignities, the dehumanization of your lives because we want to hold on to a symbol of a damned horrible past.
Dr. Sadler, the point that you make, though, is so what happens when privilege is threatened?
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
Privilege.
Exactly. I want to move on to another question here. It has to sort of do with the nature of the way these changes are occurring. So many people are looking at the uprisings that are going on, and that some of these statues are being toppled in the middle of a protest. And people are saying, well, it's all right that these statues go, but isn't it vandalism to have them sort of come down in the middle of a protest? Isn't it against the law the way that this is done? How should these changes come about? I just would love us to reflect on that for just a second.
Can I jump in here? Because I had to cut parts of my introduction, right? And so I'm glad that other people have jumped in and nuanced a lot of the history, because, I couldn't cover all that history. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was when we talk about memory sanctions and toppling of statues in antiquity, we often talk about either you had a statue legally taken down, like there was an imperial or local order, or extra legally. Right. And I'm very particular in not talking about it being illegal. It's just outside of the bounds of law. And what happened is, I think some of what we're seeing happen here is the community said, no, we want to condemn this person's memory. And they pull down the statue, right? Because there's a power in that that empowers the community in certain sorts of ways. And that then the law had to go, oh, okay, well, we should do that. And I think that is, what's happening with these statues in their representation of symbolism, right? Is when people are more concerned about vandalism of an object, right? The major rule in our house is that people are always more important than things. And when we're worried about an object, and then we hide behind this, oh, well, we didn't want anybody to get hurt, for example, which was the claim of the Richmond police this past weekend. We didn't want anybody to get hurt at the J.E.B. Stewart, so we tear gas them and we rubber bulleted, right? The only people who are doing hurt are our police, right? That I think that we get stuck on this sort of sense that that illegal, vandalism is a law, right? You don't do that, right? But the tagging that's happened is actually beautiful, and this reclaiming of space, right? And that sometimes our laws are just wrong, right? Enslavement was a law, and that was really wrong, right? I think that talking about this as illegal isn't helpful, but using this language of extra legal is perhaps a better sort of way to get at, sometimes we need to take the law on.
But when you talk about law, you have to admit that these edifices and tributes, these standing tributes, were dedicated to people who broke the law.
Yes.
They were treasonous.
Yep.
They attempted to overthrow the government.
Yep.
And no one wants to deal with that elephant in the room from the standpoint of even, the names of military bases, from the standpoint of where, oh, they were great defenders. It's they try to, overthrow Washington, for crying out loud.
Amen.
Thank you. Well, a lot of people talk about this conversation as one about a notion of free speech. We as Americans enjoy free speech. We should be able to say whatever it is that we like. And this is our way of claiming our heritage, our pride and our heritage. So shouldn't we have the ability to freely speak? And then other people might say something like, your free speech is actually impinging upon my life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, my dignity as a human being, et cetera, et cetera. What role does the notion about free speech and the protection of these symbols play in this discourse?
For me, I think it's the adage of yelling fire in a crowded theater. You go back to that argument, and the other side comes down to who's listening and what did they do with that information?
I'm not sure about this, but I thought that there is a distinction between free speech and hate speech.
Yes.
And I'm not a legal scholar at all, but I think that it would be important for us to think deeply about those distinctions between free speech and hate speech, and speech that, as you say, infringes upon the right of someone else to live and flourish. And Confederate monuments and Confederate symbols were, for all of kind of the historical nuances that can be made, they symbolized a way of life that required, and in many ways, again, theologically, understood the subjugation of Black life, the subjugation, demonization, and dehumanization and bestialization of Black life to be God ordained. That
they forced them to put up the statues here, right? Like the supposed free Black person was still enlisted to put up this symbol of hate for them. I mean, it's very active.
Right.
And in many regards, it ended up becoming an in-your-face scenario.
Right. And a mechanism of discipline, even contemporarily. I mean, it's allowing Michael Brown Jr. to lay in the street for hours, right, as a mechanism of discipline. This is the power that we continue to wield over Black bodies. It is the power that emanates from the logics of the slavocracy, and which tells me, right, a logic that tells me today that I am not fully human and that my life does not matter. My life, the lives of my children, the lives of the people I love. And so in that regard, we have to be able to distinguish between free speech and hate speech. And the symbols of the Confederacy, even though they do not speak, they signify, and they signify hate. That is very much a part of American heritage.
Yes, it is.
And I would say they do speak. I think they do speak. I think that there's a phrase I learned once: you cannot not communicate, right? So I think even these statues and these statements and these marks, they're saying something.
They certainly are saying something. They certainly are saying something quite powerful, and they continue to perpetuate an injustice in the way that we view this larger world. As we're coming to the close of our conversation today, I just want to begin to think about what do we do with this going forward? How do we participate as people in the removal, the deconstruction, and then dismantling of the symbology that exists in this larger world? Let me start with you, Christine. What can we as Christian people, what can we as people of faith do to participate in the work of getting rid of these symbols in our space?
Well, I think I can only speak from my personal perspective, right? So it's going to matter a lot where you sit from, but as a cis white woman, right, with privilege, I think my job and what I sort of try to do is first of all, my job is built on teaching uncomfortable stories. And when my students tell me I can't go preach that at church, and it's not just about being anti-racist, but it's all about the political realities of the history of our church, and like the fact that we can't just tell a Western triumphalist narrative because that sort of upholds white supremacy, that I think what I can do is I can spread the truth, to borrow Dr. Marshall Terman's language, right again from Dr. Towns, right, that there's a way in which the truth needs to be spread, and we are all called to different types of work. But for me, and part of why I agreed to participate, is we need to know what our truth is, right? Which means getting our facts straight and then understanding how those facts are warped. And that's not enough. We can't stop there, right? But if we start changing a lot of hearts and minds, and we call out and call in people, right, that's one of the things that we can do. But then the other things are thinking very hard in economic ways and embodied ways about where we're willing to put our bodies at risk, right? So my husband and I always tend to be at a protest, and we have reasons that it's harder during COVID, but thinking about what it means to put our bodies in front of more vulnerable bodies in protest, and where we put our money and who we invest in, and, you know, very consciously beginning to redistribute what we can as we actively protest and as we actively call. And for us, that's our faith, right? Like, we are bad about going to church regularly sometimes, right? Because we have small children and we get distracted, but like, we talk with our children all the time, right? Like, we sit and we read the Bible and we talk that this is the thing that we must do, that Jesus has called us to do, and we're not doing it right unless we are dealing with that, right? So thinking always about new ways to engage is an important thing for me.
Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think the question in many regards becomes, who do we get to the table? Okay. And also the icebreaker, which is, here are the things that we have in common. Here are the things that we enjoy about our lives that we can relate to with each other. If it's family, if it's getting good educations for our kids, if it's living in safe neighborhoods, you got all that. But at the same time, you know, you have to figure out, how do you level the playing field, and how do you get the people who can affect change from a public policy standpoint to those who are venting their spleen to the streets. I mean, you know, the reality becomes, you think about many of the great conflicts where there was a Dayton Peace Accords that ended the conflict in Bosnia. You know, it was the Paris peace talks in Vietnam. So what then becomes the domestic peace talks that can at least, you know, get some traction, and even in as much find some possible solutions?
I understand my ministry, my primary ministry, to be to persons of African descent. I do teach at Yale University, and it's not, you know, a lot of persons of African descent there. But I understand my role there to be that of a sort of intellectual activism that teaches about Black life and about Black theologies and ethical perspectives in ways that will help pastors and religious leaders and community leaders as they go out into the world to think more broadly about how they do the work of ministry. But in the church, again, to Steve's point about, you know, the different ways that various groups are called to transform the world, from your lawyers to your medical people, to your teachers and to your police officers and firemen, all people that you might meet in a church congregation. I understand my role to be that of expanding theological imagination. And when I think about that in relation to Black people, I need them to understand their Blackness as part and parcel of God's identity. That there is, that Blackness is sacred, and that Black lives matter. And when you believe that you actually matter, you will fight for yourself, and you will fight for your people, and you will fight for those who you love when you believe that you actually matter. And so expanding theological imagination against kind of the white evangelical norms that have been passed down to us and performed in Blackface and Black churches is what I set out to do, because I want people, what I think the first step to doing this work is to really believing that Black lives matter. And we have to think differently about God. We have to think differently theologically in order to be spurred into the work of justice making in the world.
Thank you for that. Yes.
A couple of things from my perspective in preaching. I hope to open up the gospel in a way that does allow people to be thoughtful and imaginative, but mostly to hear it as a gospel of justice and a Jesus who is calling us all to treat each other as one. And then the other area is in fostering conversations. I I think that this is a scary topic for a lot of people. And so I like to think that part of my role is to help author these conversations so that change can happen and that we can move ahead. And I also have my vulnerability. You know, I put that out there all the time. I fall down, I get up, I try to do my homework, and I try to encourage others to do their homework as well.
Amen. Thank you for that. Let me close this conversation out with just a request from each of you to let us know, is there something that you're doing right now that you'd like to invite the audience to participate in? Is there some work that's going on that you think that they might benefit from knowing about? Please, I'll start with you, Steve.
I think I'm going to do a shameless plug for a documentary that I completed a couple of years ago. As I mentioned, I happen to be Roman Catholic. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. And in as much as that, some of you all may remember the great football player, Paul Hornung. He graduated from my high school several decades before, Archbishop Joseph Benedict Flagey. But to give you the context of this, the thing I found out, I ran across a passage which turned into a 2-year project, which later became a hour-long documentary you can find on Facebook, and I'll give you the name of the title again, but it's called Facing an Uncomfortable Truth. And the reason why, and I'll send a link to our panelists, but the reason why we framed it that way, at the time that he died, Bishop Flagey owned 19 slaves, okay? And the very first archdiocese in Kentucky, or actually it was a diocese before it became an arch, I believe, was in Bardstown, Kentucky. He bequeathed his slaves to his successor, Bishop Martin J. Spalding, who's very legendary. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. We visit with the African American Nuns and Sisters of Providence in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. You know, you will find some of the buildings, some of the edifices that slaves built that are part of the legacy of Catholicism in Kentucky. So the short version of that is called Facing an Uncomfortable Truth. And one other shameless plug for a video you can find on YouTube. It's called Quiet Valor, Silent Strength. And it deals with the role of the U.S. colored troops, simply because at the end of the Civil War, and something we did not get, in our history books in school, is the fact that when Lee surrenders to Grant in Appomattox, there are 5,000 African-American troops there. And a lot of people didn't know that, including me, till I went to the actual, reenactment, in Virginia 5 years ago. So
Okay.
that's what I'm hawking.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Marshall-Turman?
Sure. In terms of my intellectual activism, I'm working on a new book on African-American social Christianity and looking at violence, race, and gender in African-American churches. But most recently, and I put the link in the chat, I authored, along with the collective of Black pastors from around the nation, a theological statement on Black Lives Matter. We were able to release this statement on Juneteenth, and it was signed by over 1,095 pastors representing Black churches around the nation. Thank you for signing. And so within the next few weeks, we are rolling out a platform of work that we want to support churches in doing around the movement to save Black lives. And that is what I'm working on in terms of my activism in church and in society. So please check out the actual statement and be on the lookout for the work we'll be doing.
And let me say the statement is brilliant. It is an education just to read the statement. Dr. Dupree.
As I mentioned, St. Paul's has been trying to change its narrative since long before I got there. So a lot of the work has been taken on by a group called the History and Reconciliation Initiative. And they have done extensive study on the church's racial history and racial past. They also have come up with a set of recommendations around things that do need to be edited and changed in our sanctuary, as well as other items that that we need to be attending to. So I guess what we can offer is perhaps a template for those churches that might want to take this dive and don't quite know where to begin. It's at stpaulsrva.org. And again, it's called the History and Reconciliation Initiative. Have done a lot of good work.
Well, thank you for that. Dr. Luckritz Marquis, would you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I have a book that will be coming out in the next year. It's a little slower, thank you, COVID, than hoped. But it, though it's on antiquity and it's on Egypt in the 4th and 5th centuries, it has a lot of discussion of the ways in which colonialist narratives continue to influence our scholarship. And I end in the epilogue talking about these relationships to our contemporary moments. So that's there for people who are interested in exploring the relationships between violence and space and memory and forgetting. But I would just encourage folks to amplify and decenter whiteness. So what I want to do is encourage people to look for their mutual aid funds and their bail funds and their local Black shops and their local Black restaurants and spend your money there.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to each and every member of the panel for a wonderful conversation tonight. You all are brilliant and you all have added so much to this larger discourse. I want to say I've been working on a truth and reconciliation process. I want to make sure that we not only start this in Charlotte, but spread this around the country. So look for an invitation to a larger conversation about what we can do to help keep this conversation going wherever we are. We know that it's going on in some place. Kellogg is doing some great work with this. A lot of national groups are doing this, but maybe you live in a small town where you need to begin to take a look at how you can participate in the truth and reconciliation process. I just also wanted to say that this is a significant conversation. Symbols have significant power. They shape our lives, they inform the way that we live, and they continue to influence power relationships in our world in ways that are not inconsequential. We need to make sure that we address these concerns if we are to truly have an effective movement that says Black lives really do matter. Thank you all for attending tonight. Please keep on the lookout for subsequent conversations on Black Lives Matter and other things that we'll be doing with Union Presbyterian Seminary. For the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, for the Katie Geneva Canon, Center for Womenist Leadership, we thank you all for joining us tonight. God bless you all.